Hi, it's Nicole. I talk about books on my channel. The anniversary of the death of Thomas Hardy was a few days ago. He died on 11th of January 1928, and Virginia Woolf published an essay called Thomas Hardy's Novels in Times Literary Supplement as a kind of eulogy. In Genius and Ink, which is a collection of Virginia Woolf's essays written for Times Literary Supplements over the years, in the introduction it says, in 1919, she opened a fresh notebook to gather her thoughts on her father's friend Thomas Hardy in response to a request from Richmond, the editor of Times Literary Supplement at the time, in response to a request from Richmond to be ready with an article on Hardy's novels whenever the evil day comes. She worked sporadically on the piece, Thomas Hardy's novels, for the next 10 years. Hardy died at the age of 88. I'm going to mark this occasion by reading out the essay and try to summarize the key points paragraph by paragraph and point out a few of the interesting things I found along the way. So let's go.
When we say that the death of Thomas Hardy leaves the art of fiction in England without a head, we are speaking the most obvious of truth. So long as Hardy lived, there was not a writer who did not feel that his calling was crowned by the unworldly and simple old man who made not the slightest effort to assert his sovereignty, yet stood for more to this generation than it is possible for any single voice to say. The effect of such a presence is indeed incalculable. His greatness as a writer, his standing among the great of other ages, will be judged perhaps more truly by critics of a later day. But it is for the living to bear witness to another sort of influence, hardly less important, though bound in the nature of things, more quickly to disappear. His was a spiritual force. He made it seem honourable to write, desirable to write with sincerity. So long as he lived, there was no excuse for thinking meanly of the art he practised. His genius, his age, his distance might remove all possibility of intercourse. The plainness and homeliness of his life lent him an obscurity which neither legend nor gossip disturbed. But it is no exaggeration to say that while he lived, there was a king among us, and now we are without. Of no one, however, would it be more unfitting to write in terms of rhetorical eulogy. His only demands upon us, and there is none more exacting, was that we should speak the truth.
Virginia Woolf gives Thomas Hardy really high praises right from the start. She uses phrases and words like the head of the art of fiction in England, crowned, and sovereignty, and she says it is no exaggeration to say that while he lived, there was a king among us, and now we are without. She draws attention to his influence among the contemporary and says let a later generation judges his greatness as a writer. I don't know what happens in the academic world or the publishing world, but you can tell he's been popular and he's still popular today just by looking at how many of his titles are still available today in bookshops and how often you can find him in secondhand bookshops. And then Woolf said, I am not going to speak pretty words as people usually do when someone dies. I'm going to speak my mind and speak the truth.
Our task then, as we consider the 17 volumes of fiction which he has left us, is not to attempt to grade them in order of merit or to assign them to their final station in English literature. Rather, we must try to discover the broad outlines of his genius, to distinguish between those qualities which are and those which are not still forces in the life of the present moment, to content ourselves with conjectures rather than attempt the more exact and measured estimate which time will bring within our reach. Let us go back to the beginning, to the year 1871, to the first novel, Desperate Remedies, and make our starting point there. Here is a young man, as he says in his preface, feeling his way to a method, a young man of powerful imagination and of sardonic turn, book-learned in a homemade way, who can create characters but cannot control them, obviously hampered by the difficulties of his technique, and driven, both by maladroitness and by an innate desire to pit his human figures against forces outside themselves, to shape his book by an extreme and even desperate use of coincidence. He is already possessed of the conviction that a novel is not a toy or an argument, but can deal faithfully with life, and record a truthful, if not a pleasing, account of the destinies of men and women. Had there been in those days a critic of abnormal perspicacity, he might have said that the most remarkable thing in this first book was not character or plot or humour, but the sound that echoed and boomed through its pages of a waterfall. It is the first manifestation of that power, which was to grow to such huge dimensions later. It is not the power of observing nature, though already Hardy knew how the rain falls differently on roots and arable, how the wind sounds differently through the branches of different trees. It is the power of making a symbol of nature, of summoning a spirit from down or mill wheel or moor, which can sympathize or can mock or can remain a passive and indifferent spectator of the drama of man. Already that gift was his. Already in this crude story, the involved fortunes of Miss Aldclyffe and Cytherea are watched by the eyes of the gods and worked out in the presence of nature. That he was a poet should have been obvious. That he was a novelist might still have been held uncertain. But the year after, when Under the Greenwood Tree appeared, it was clear that much of the effort of feeling for a method has been overcome. Something of the stubborn originality of the earlier book was lost. The second is accomplished, charming, idyllic, compared with the first. The writer, it seems, may well develop into one of our English landscape painters, whose pictures are all of cottage gardens and old peasant women, who lingers to collect and preserve from oblivion the old-fashioned ways and words which are rapidly falling into disuse. And yet, what kindly lover of antiquity, what naturalist with a microscope in his pocket, what scholar solicitous for the changing shapes of language, ever heard the cry of a small bird killed in the next wood by an owl with such intensity? The cry passed into the silence without mingling with it. Again we hear, very far away, like the sound of a gun out at sea on a calm summer's morning, a strange and ominous echo. But as we read these early books, there's a sense of waste. There's a feeling that Hardy's genius was obstinate and perverse. First one gift would have its way with him, and then another. They would not consent to run together easily in harness. Such indeed was likely to be the fate of a writer who was at once poet and realist, a faithful son of field and down, yet tormented by the doubts and despondencies bred of book learning, a lover of old ways and plain countrymen, yet doomed to see the faith and flesh of his forefathers turn to thin and spectral transparencies before his eyes.
So Virginia Woolf said, "My job here is not to rank all his novels, but to talk about what makes him the kind of great writer he is." So his first novel was not masterful in terms of techniques, but you can already tell he has started to use nature as a force in his story. And his techniques matured in Under the Greenwood Tree, and you can tell his love for the old-fashioned way of living in the English countryside, the farming community. And he seems to not be able to control his gifts because he sees the beauty of this old way of living, but he also sees the unavoidable reality of this old way dying away.
To this contradiction, nature had added another element, likely to disorder a symmetrical development. Some writers, as readers we know it, though as critics we may fail to explain it, are born conscious of everything, other unconscious of many things. Some, like Henry James and Flaubert, are able not merely to make the best use of the spoil their gifts bring in, but beyond that, they control their genius in the act of creation. They remain aware and awake and are never taken by surprise. The unconscious writers, on the other hand, like Dickens and Scott, seem suddenly and without their own consent to be lifted up and swept onwards. The wave sinks, and they cannot say what has happened or why. Among them, it is the source of his strength and the source of his weakness we must place Hardy. His own word, Moments of Vision, exactly describes those passages of astonishing beauty and force, which are to be found in every book that he wrote. With a sudden quickening of power, which we cannot foretell, nor he seems control, a single scene breaks off from the rest. We see, as if he existed alone and for all time, the wagon with Fanny's dead body inside, travelling along the road under the dripping trees. We see the bloated sheep struggling among the clover. We see Troy flashing his sword round Bathsheba, where she stands motionless, cutting the lock off her head and spitting the caterpillar on her breast. Vivid to the eye, but not to the eye alone, for every sense participates. Such scenes dawn upon us, and their splendour remains. But the power goes as it comes, and the moment of vision is succeeded by long stretches of plain daylight. Nor can we believe that any craft or skill could have caught the wild power and turned it to the best advantage. The novels, therefore, are full of inequalities. They are hewn rather than polished. There is always about them that little blur of consciousness, that halo of freshness and margin of the unexpressed, which often produce the most profound sense of satisfaction. It is as if Hardy himself were not quite aware of what he did, as if his consciousness held more than he could produce, and he left it for his readers to make out his full meaning and to supplement it from their own experience.
Virginia Woolf here identifies two groups of writers. One is conscious of the whole writing process and is in control. The other is not, and Hardy belongs to the second group. As a result, some parts of the novels are genius and some are quite ordinary, and Hardy just leaves them as they are.
For these reasons, Hardy's genius was uncertain in development, uneven in accomplishment, but when the moment came, magnificent in achievement. The moment came, completely and fully, in Far from the Madding Crowd. The subject was right, the method was right, the poet and the countryman, the sensual man, the sombre reflective man, the man of learning, all enlisted to produce a book which, however fashions may chop and change, must remain one of the great English novels. There is, in the first place, that sense of the physical world which Hardy more than any novelist can bring before us. The sense that the little prospect of man's existence is reigned by a landscape which, while it exists apart, yet confers a deep and solemn beauty upon his drama. The dark downland, marked by the barrows of the dead and the huts of shepherds, rises against the sky, smooth as a wave of the sea, but solid and eternal, rolling away to the infinite distance, but sheltering in its folds quiet villages whose smoke rises in frail columns by day, whose lamps burn in the immense darkness by night. Gabriel Oak, tending his sheep up there on the back of the world, is the eternal shepherd. The stars are ancient beacons, and for ages he has watched beside his sheep. But down in the valley, the earth is full of warmth and life. The farms are busy, the barns stored, the fields loud with lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep. Nature is prolific, splendid and lustful, not yet malignant, and still the great mother of labouring man. And now for the first time Hardy gives full play to his humour. Where it is freest and most rich, upon the lips of countrymen. John Cogan and Henry Frey and Joseph Poorgrass gather in the moat house when the day's work is over and give vent to the half-shrewd, half-poetic humour which has been brewing in their brains and finding expression over their beer since the Pilgrims tramped the Pilgrim's Way, which Shakespeare and Scott and George Eliot all loved to overhear, but none loved better or heard with greater understanding than Hardy. But it is not the part of the peasants in the Wessex novels to stand out as individuals. They compose a pool of common wisdom, a fount of perpetual life. They comment upon the actions of the hero and heroine. But while Troy, or Oak, or Fanny, or Bathsheba come in and out and pass away, Jan Cogan and Henry Frey and Joseph Poorgrass remain. They drink by night and they plough the fields by day. They are eternal. We meet them over and over again in the novels, and they always have something typical about them, more of the character that marks a race than of the features which belong to an individual. The peasants are the great sanctuary of sanity, the country the last stronghold of happiness. When they disappear, there is no hope for the race.
Woolf talks about Far from the Madding Crowd here and thinks it's Hardy's highest achievement so far. Far from the Madding Crowd is the only Hardy I read so far, but I have to say, watching the excellent film adaptation completely ruined my reading experience. It's obvious, but just let me say this. You can only read a book fresh once. Beware of TV and film adaptations, especially if they are good. Back to Woolf. In Far From the Madding Crowd, man feels very small in contrast to the landscape, but the never-changing landscape also gives man an eternal quality. The story of Bathsheba, Troy, and Oak happens and ends, but the farmhands and their work, spring, summer, autumn, and winter stay the same.
With Oak and Troy and Bathsheba and Fanny Robin, we come to the men and women of the novels at their full stature. In every book, 3 or 4 figures predominate and stand up like lightning conductors to attract the force of the elements. Oak and Troy and Bathsheba, Eustacia, Waldeave and Ben, Henchard, Lucetta and Farfrae, Jude, Sue Brighthead and Philistine. There is even a certain likeness between the certain groups. They live as individuals and they differ as individuals, but they also live as types and have a likeness as types. Bathsheba is Bathsheba, but she is a woman and sister to Eustacia and Lucetta and Sue. Gabriel Oak is Gabriel Oak, but he is man and brother to Henchard, Ben and Jude. However lovable and charming Bathsheba may be, still she is weak. However stubborn and ill-guided Henchard may be, still he is strong. This is fundamental. This is the core of Hardy's vision, and drawn from the deepest sources of his nature. The woman is the weaker and the fleshier, and she clings to the stronger and obscures his vision. How freely, nevertheless, in his greater books, life is poured over the unalterable framework. When Bathsheba sits in the wagon among her plants, smiling at her own loveliness in the little looking-glass, we may know, and it is proof of Hardy's power that we do know, how severely she will suffer and cause others to suffer before the end. But the moment has all the bloom and beauty of life, and so it is, time and time again. His characters, both men and women, were creatures to him of an infinite attraction. For the women, he shows a more tender solicitude than for the men, and in them perhaps he takes a keener interest. Vain might their beauty be, and terrible their fate, but while the glow of life is in them, their step is free, their laughter sweet, and theirs is the power to sink into the breast of nature and become part of her silence and solemnity, or to rise and put on them the movement of the clouds and the wildness of the flowering woodlands. The men who suffer, not like the women through dependence upon other human beings, but through conflict with fate, enlist our sterner sympathies. For such a man as Gabriel Oak, we need have no passing fears. Honour him we must, though it is not granted us to love him quite so freely. He is firmly set upon his feet, and can give as shrewd a blow, to men at least, as any he is likely to receive. He has a prevision of what is to be expected that springs from character rather than from education. He is stable in his temperament, steadfast in his affections, and capable of open-eyed endurance without flinching. But he, too, is no puppet. He is homely, humdrum fellow on ordinary occasions. He can walk the streets without making people turn to stare at him. In short, nobody can deny Hardy's power, the true novelist's power, to make us believe that his characters are fellow human beings, driven by their own passions and idiosyncrasies, while they have, and this is the poet's gift, something symbolic about them, which is common to us all.
Woolf compares the 3 main characters' structure in Hardy's 4 novels. They represent certain types of people and they have a lot in common. Although Hardy sticks to his trail framework, he gives each character life abundantly. Each of them is unique, although at the same time, he or she represents us all in some ways.
And it is at this point, when we are considering Hardy's power of creating men and women, that we become most conscious of the profound differences that distinguish him from his peers. We look back at a number of these characters and ask ourselves what it is that we remember them for. We recall their passions, we remember how deeply they have loved each other, and often with what tragic results. We remember the faithful love of Oak for Bathsheba, the tumultuous but fleeting passions of men like Waldeave, Troy, and Fitzspiers. We remember the filial love of Clym for his mother, the jealous paternal passion of Henchard for Elizabeth Jane. But we do not remember how they have loved. We do not remember how they talked and changed and got to know each other, finally, gradually, from step to step, and from stage to stage. Their relationship is not composed of those intellectual apprehensions and subtleties of perception which seem so slight yet are so profound. In all the books, love is one of the great facts that mold human life, but it is a catastrophe. It happens suddenly and overwhelmingly, and there is little to be said about it. The talk between the lovers, when it is not passionate, is practical or philosophic, as though the discharge of their daily duties left them with more desire to question life and its purpose than to investigate each other's sensibilities. Even if it were in their characters to analyze their emotions, life is too stirring to give them time. They need all their strength to deal with the downright blows, the freakish ingenuity, the gradually increasing malignity of fate. They have none to spend upon the subtleties and delicacies of the human comedy. Thus there comes a time when we can say with certainty that we shall not find in Hardy some of the qualities that have given us most delight in the works of other novelists. He has not the perfection of Jane Austen, or the wit of Meredith, or the range of Thackeray, or Tolstoy's amazing intellectual power. There is in the work of the great classical writers a finality of effect which places certain of their scenes apart from the story, beyond the reach of change. We do not ask what bearing they have upon the narrative, nor do we make use of them to interpret problems which lie on the outskirts of the scene. A laugh, a blush, half a dozen words of dialogue, and it is enough. The source of our delight is perennial. But Hardy has none of this concentration and completeness. His light does not fall directly upon the human heart. It passes over it and out onto the darkness of the heath and upon the trees swaying in the storm. When we look back into the room, the group by the fireside is dispersed. Each man or woman is battling with the storm, alone, revealing himself most when he is least under the observation of other human beings. We do not know them as we know Pierre, or Natasha, or Becky Sharp. We do not know them in and out and all round as they are revealed to the casual caller, to the government official, to the great lady, to the general on the battlefield. We do not know the complication and involvement and turmoil of their thoughts. Geographically, too, they remain fixed to the same stretch of the English countryside, and it is seldom, and not with happy results, that Hardy leaves the yeoman or farmer to describe the class above theirs in the social scale. In the drawing-room and club-room and ball-room, where people of leisure and education come together, where comedy is bred and shades of character revealed, he is awkward and ill at ease, but the opposite is equally true. If we do not know his men and women in their relations to each other, we know them in their relations to time, death, and fate. If we do not see them in quick agitation against the lights and crowds of cities, we see them against the earth, the storm, and the seasons. We know their attitudes towards some of the most tremendous problems that can confront mankind. They take on a more than mortal size in memory. We see them not in detail, but enlarged and dignified. We see Tess reading the baptismal service in her nightgown with an impress of dignity that was almost regal. We see Marty South like a being who had rejected with indifference the attribute of sex for the loftier quality of abstract humanism, laying the flowers on Winterbourne's grave. Their speech has a biblical dignity and poetry. They have a force in them which cannot be defined, a force of love or of hate, a force which in the men is the cause of rebellion against life, and in the women implies an illimitable capacity for suffering. And it is this which dominates the character and makes it unnecessary that we should see the finer features that lie hid. This is the tragic power, and if we are to place Hardy among his fellows, we must call him the greatest tragic writer among English novelists. Thus, if we are to appreciate him truly, we must look at the outer conflict, not at the inner. We must read him for his scenes, not for his sentences. for his poetry, not for his prose.
What makes Hardy different from other writers is that we as readers don't know his characters well, not in the same way as we know Jane Austen or Thackeray's characters. Hardy's characters don't relate to each other, they relate to the nature and the world as isolated individuals.
But let us, as we approach the danger zone of Hardy's philosophy, be on our guard. Nothing is more necessary in reading an imaginative writer than to keep at the right distance above his page. Nothing is easier, especially with a writer of marked tendency, than to fasten on opinions, convict him of a creed, tether him to a consistent point of view. Nor was Hardy any exception to the rule that the mind which is most capable of receiving impressions is very often the least capable of drawing conclusions. It is for the reader, steeped in the impression, to supply the comment. It is his part to know when to put aside the writer's conscious intention in favor of some deeper intention of which perhaps he may be unconscious. Hardy himself was aware of this. A novel is an impression, not an argument. He has warned us, and again, unadjusted impressions have their value, and the road to a true philosophy of life seems to lie in humbly recording diverse readings of its phenomena, as they are forced upon us by chance and change. Certainly it is true to say of him that at his greatest he gives us impressions, at his weakest arguments. In The Woodlanders, The Return of the Native, Far from the Madding Crowd, and above all, in The Mayor of Casterbridge, we have Hardy's impression of life as it came to him without conscious ordering. Let him once begin to tamper with his direct intuitions, and his power is gone. "Did you say the stars were worlds, Tess?" asks little Abraham as they drive to market with their beehives. Tess replies that they are like the apples on our stub-bud tree, most of them splendid and sound, a few blighted. "Which do we live on, a splendid or a blighted one?" "A blighted one," she replies, or rather the mournful thinker who has assumed her mask speaks for her. The words protrude, cold and raw, like the springs of a machine where we had seen only flesh and blood. We are crudely jolted out of that mode of sympathy, which is renewed a moment later when the little cart is run down, and we have a concrete instance of the ironical methods which rule our planet.
Here, Virginia Woolf contrasts impression and argument. I'm not 100% sure I get what she means. In How to Read a Book, there's a chapter called Coming to Terms with an Author. I don't think I have come to terms with Virginia Woolf here. But anyway, Hardy seems to do a way better job giving impressions unconsciously than going against what comes most natural to him.
That is the reason why Jude the Obscure is the most painful of all Hardy's books, and the only one against which we can fairly bring the charge of pessimism. In Jude the Obscure, argument is allowed to dominate impression, with the result that, though the misery of the book is overwhelming, it is not tragic. As calamity succeeds calamity, we feel that the case against society is not being argued fairly or with profound understanding of the facts. Here is nothing of that width and force and knowledge of mankind which, when Tolstoy criticizes society, makes his indictment formidable. Here we have revealed to us the petty cruelty of man, not the large injustice of the gods. It is only necessary to compare Jude the Obscure with Mayor of Casterbridge to see where Hardy's true power lay. Jude carries on his miserable contests against the deans of colleges and the conventions of sophisticated society. Henchard is pitted not against another man, but against something outside himself, which is opposed to men of his ambition and power. No human being wishes him ill. Even Farfrae and Newson and Elizabeth Jane, whom he has wronged, all come to pity him, even to admire his strength of character. He is standing up to fate, and in backing the old mayor, whose ruin has been largely his own fault. Hardy makes us feel that we are backing human nature in an unequal contest. There is no pessimism here. Throughout the book, we are aware of the sublimity of the issue, and yet it is presented to us in the most concrete form. From the opening scene in which Henchard sells his wife to the sailor at the fair to his death on Egdon Heath, the vigour of the story is superb. Its humour rich and racy, its movement large-limbed and free. The skimmity ride, the fight between Farfrae and Hanchard in the loft, Mrs. Cuxton's speech upon the death of Mrs. Hanchard, the talk of the ruffians at Peter's Finger with nature present in the background or mysteriously dominating the foreground, are among the glories of English fiction. Meagre and scanty it may be, is the measure of happiness allowed to each. But so long as the struggle is as Hanchard's was, with the decrees of fate and not with the laws of man, so long as it is in the open air and calls for activity of the body rather than of the brain, there is greatness in the contest. And the death of the broken corn merchant in his cottage on Acton Heath is comparable to the death of Ajax, lord of Salamis. The true tragic emotion is ours.
Jude the Obscure lies on the other end of the spectrum, where arguments dominates impression. Comparing it with the Mayor of Casterbridge, the latter provokes more intense emotion in the readers.
Before such power as this, we are made to feel that the ordinary tests which we apply to fiction are futile enough. Do we insist that a great novelist shall be a master of melodious prose? Hardy was no such thing. He feels his way by dint of sagacity and uncompromising sincerity to the phrase he wants, and it is often of unforgettable pungency. Failing it, he will make do with any homely or clumsy or old-fashioned turn of speech, now of the utmost plainness, now of a bookish elaboration. No style in literature, save Scott's, is so difficult to analyze. It is on the face of it so bad, yet it achieves its aim so unmistakably. As well might one attempt to rationalize the charm of a muddy country road, or of a plain field of roots in winter, and then, like Dorsetshire itself, out of these very elements of stiffness and angularity, his prose will put on greatness, will roll with a Latin sonority, will shape itself in a massive and monumental symmetry like that of his own bare downs. Then again, do we require that a novelist shall observe the probabilities and keep close to reality? To find anything approaching the violence and convolution of Hardy's plots, one must go back to the Elizabethan drama. Yet we accept his story completely as we read it. And more than that, it becomes obvious that his violence and his melodrama, when they are not due to a curious peasant-like love of the monstrous for its own sake, are part of that wild spirit of poetry which saw with intense irony and grimness that no reading of life can possibly outdo the strangeness of life itself. No symbol of caprice and unreason be too extreme to present the astonishing circumstances of our existence.
Here, Virginia Woolf argues, the ordinary tests don't apply to Hardy. If you do, he might fail. But his style does what it needs to do and does it brilliantly. His plots might look too dramatic or improbable for real life, but life is stranger than fiction.
But as we consider the great structure of the Wessex novels, it seems irrelevant to fasten on little points. This character, that scene, this phrase of deep and poetic beauty, it is something larger that Hardy has bequeathed to us. Like every great novelist, he gives us not merely a world which we can liken to the world we know, but an attitude towards it, an atmosphere surrounding it, which is of far greater importance and lasts long after the world which the novelist portrays has vanished forever. This spirit, though it is in the scene, exists apart from the scene. It is in the life and character of the writer, as well as in the art and language that he uses. The greater the writer, the more completely the different elements are fused into one. That is why the effect of a great novel is so commanding, so complete, yet so extremely difficult to analyze in words. When we read the Wessex novels, we have to free ourselves from the cramp and pettiness imposed by life. Our imaginations have to expand and soar. Our humor has to laugh out. We have to drink deep of the beauty of the earth. But also we have to enter the shade of a sorrowful and brooding spirit, which even in its saddest mood still bore itself with a grave uprightness, and never, even when most moved to anger, lost its simple tenderness for the suffering of men and women. Thus it is no mere transcript of life at a certain time and place that Hardy has given us. It is a vision of the world and of man's lot as they revealed themselves to an astonishing imagination, a profound and poetic genius, a gentle and humane soul. It is for this, a gift of lasting and inexhaustible value, that we have to thank him today.
At the end of the day, at the end of Hardy's life, what's the most important thing Hardy gives us and leaves with us? Is the attitude towards the world, which is more important than the old world itself. We laugh heartily, we admire the beautiful landscape, and we feel tenderly towards the characters, because Hardy himself felt tenderly for the characters. That's the end of the essay. I applied my limited intelligence to the text and felt greatly challenged. The summaries are all my own, so don't quote them in your essay writing, but hopefully it's of some value and interest to you. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one. Bye!